My editor had been Googling me and somehow discovered something about me being homeschooled. He realized that he couldn't find any homeschool books published by a major mainstream publisher. And to communicate aesthetically, visually, the energy of homeschooling. I think learning how to learn and being excited about that realization that, oh, I can do this. If I want to know about something, here's how you go about knowing about something. There's really nothing you can't teach yourself. One of the most valuable things to come out of homeschooling, I think.
I'm really curious about, the process of writing a autobiographical or semi-autobiographical children's book and creating
Right.
that world that's so captivating.
I'll hold the book up here just so people can see what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know how the lighting works, and of course it's backward now and on the screen I see, but that's the book we're talking about. Um, yeah, so what it's like writing an autobiographical, I call it semi-autobiographical because in the book, well, there are many ways in which it doesn't directly detail for detail follow my family's journey. And I felt that was important because I needed in some way to create a little bit of distance there so that I could feel free to turn it into something that feels as warm in book form as my experience felt. And I'll just explain what I mean. And one of the tactics I used initially when I started working on it, I was drawing things very realistically. I had a hard time getting out of my head how everything actually looked. And
Sure.
so one of the serendipitous things that happened was this moment where I thought, well, what if I just flip everything mirror image so that I'm not as bound to the landscape or the house or other details as I would be if it was as I recall it. So I flipped everything, the landscape mirror image, and that helped a whole lot because then it just created a little bit of this barrier where then I could say, okay, if I were building a house, if I were setting the landscape up just the way I would really want it to be, if I were experiencing this myself, had a family, moving to the country, designing a house, how would I want it to be? And that was a key development in the process of making the book, especially visually.
So when you say flipping, do you mean like literally kind of mirroring the
Yes,
image?
literally, right. So what I just showed you on the screen, if I had it open to the pages, it would be back the way it is in reality. But that gave me the freedom to start to invent, which is really important because being bound to things in a kind of photorealistic or too literal of a way can really get in the way of telling a good story.
Mm.
And so I have my cat joining me here now. Um, and so that was one part that really helped, one development that really helped in the telling of the story. And then the other very big detail that gets left out of the actual book is that it took my mom and my dad, they moved to the property in 1978. We lived in a trailer, a mobile home. So the camper that's in the book is not exactly what we lived in. Um, I'll just describe that in the book. It's a tiny little, not exactly a pop-up camper, but something very small that you could tow behind a truck.
Right.
Whereas in reality, it was a mobile home that you would see in a trailer park,
Okay.
except they
Sure.
had pulled it out to a field, essentially, created a level spot with some plumbing, a septic system, and um, began living there. and then began building, and they weren't done until 1985. So it took 6 years, 6 to 7 years total that they were working
Wow.
the property and the house. Whereas in the book, it takes a little over a year to build. For brevity's sake, you can only go through the season so many times before the reader begins to ask when this will all be over. Which is
Right.
what my parents in reality were, I'm sure, asking all the time. When will this all be over? In fact, there was a period where my dad and my mom just were so overworked that they didn't know if they could complete it. They just were beginning to be fed up with it. My dad prayed a prayer about having more time to work on the house. And then within a week or two of praying that prayer, he got laid off from his job, which was not
Wow.
exactly the answer he was looking for. He eventually got rehired, I think, in several months. It was during an economic downturn. I'm not sure the reasons
Mm.
for it, but that having that chunk of time, just it was like being on riding a bike on a hill, and you're at the top, and you're like, if I can just get to this point, then I'll start to, momentum and coast downhill, and you can begin to see that you're going to get up and over this rise. And that's sort of what it was. They had that period of work and then realized, okay, I think this is doable. And they finished it eventually, of course, with help from friends. And you see that in the book as well. Friends and family are there at various points helping out. Um, and so, yeah, circling back to your question about what it's like writing an autobiographical book, I'd say it does depend on your aim. If you're aiming for something like a realistic memoir, that's one thing. But because of the format of the book and it being a picture book, it had to be adjusted in certain ways. I had to take liberties in telling the story to make it work. And so certain ways of, like I mentioned, creating a little bit of distance was very helpful. And then at the end of the book, there's also some photos of the actual house building, me when I'm very young, and my sisters and my dad, and more of the realistic detail is filled in there so that the reader understands this is not word for word, image by image, exactly how everything happened. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious about sort of the what the experience was like then moving on to this is my house, this is my school.
Okay.
And how that project differed from the building our house.
Yeah, that one is a kind of, that was the way that one originated was a little unusual in that my editor had been Googling me and somehow discovered something about me being homeschooled. It was some article that had been
Oh,
published,
wow.
and he realized that he couldn't find any homeschool books published by a major mainstream publisher. There are now, I think, multiple books that have been published by, and maybe one other one. I saw one recently that came out that had some homeschooling features to it. So there are more things now, and certainly more things by smaller, often independent publishing houses. But
Sure.
as far as mainstream publishers, there hadn't been anything. And so he thought this would be a great opportunity to get ahead of the curve and get something out there. And it's done well. It's sold pretty well. But I had never really been given an idea like that before. And then that was a different kind of process, figuring out like, okay, that's an interesting idea. How am I going to turn this into a story that I want to tell? And so in the end, I did something that I think confused people a little bit, because stylistically, building our house and this is my home, this is my school are different.
Yes.
And that's because figure out, I simply could not accept that the same style would work for this is my home, this is my school. I don't know what your homeschooling experience was like, but my mom was very organized. She wrote out lesson plans every week. We had to follow those lesson plans to keep us on track. And we would cross things off every day as we went down the list of subjects. And so it was very organized. But despite that, homeschool's just, there's a lot of creativity, there's a lot of energy. And I simply couldn't see illustrating that story in the same way that I had illustrated Building Our House, which is about, and this is going to be a mini art lesson, so I hope you don't mind, which is about building something that's solid and feels strong and is this base for a family growing together, for building a family. And so if you look at the illustrations in Building Our House, there's a lot of straight lines and firm lines and verticals and horizontals. And in This Is My Home, This Is My School, I actually used I didn't use a brush. I used a bamboo pen for the line work.
Oh, wow.
And I stood back from the drawing desk, so I was getting lines that were less controlled because I wanted to communicate aesthetically, visually, the energy of homeschooling. And even though the characters are the same characters with the addition of the youngest sister in the homeschool book, and they're a little bit older, the style creates a very different feeling. And so I think it threw some readers because it took a little bit to make that connection. Oh, this is the same place. The style has changed that the illustrator is using, but it's a continuation of the story. But that's part of my makeup, I guess, and the way I think about illustrating is that there has to be this nice dovetailing of style and content that I don't even necessarily like the word style, but I would say the formal elements, the substance of the thing has to somehow communicate at a fundamental level what the book is about. And so that's why stylistically the homeschool book is much more scribbly and the watercolor is done much more splashily. And I think it gets across that energy of what a homeschool feels like. And then of course, I added things. If I was being homeschooled again, what would I ideally want the living room to look like? And so there's a banana tree growing in the living room of our house. We did not have a banana tree. We did not have a parrot in a cage. So there are things that I've embellished and romanticized in a way, but many of the basic details of the book are the same. For instance, and I don't remember the chemicals involved, but we did a chemistry experiment, which shows up in the book. This was outside, not in our basement. It had something to do with sodium because what was coming out was sulfur fumes.
Oh, no.
And we got a little too close to it and sniffed some of the fumes, and it really burned, like our noses were burning. And so we quickly called Dad at his work to ask him if we had done something that was dangerous. And I think he assured us, no, don't go smelling it anymore, but you're going to be fine. So that's one of the details that made it into the book. And as far as the writing, I hit upon the idea that I would draw parallels between public school and homeschooling in the writing, so that in the writing you would hear about all the family's classrooms. I'll hold this book up so people can see it.
Yeah.
And then they can also see stylistically how it differs. So here is, once again, the cover of Building Our House. There you can see the verticals and horizontals and the solid lines, even right on the cover. And then this is my home, this is my school.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can see the stylistic difference. And then the writing parallels. So you have classrooms, you have the cafeteria, all the elements that you would have in a typical book, picture book about school, like someone's first day at school. But in this book, it's the pictures that let the reader in on the kind of joke that's happening, in that this isn't a normal classroom. The classroom, they have many classrooms. One is the stream, one is the basement, one is doing canning, peach canning. So they have many classrooms. And their cafeteria, of course, is their kitchen where they eat lunch. And what else? Their library, actually, they do go to a library in a public school where the other kids are being schooled. We did that as a
Oh, wow.
homeschool family. I remember being in the local elementary school and seeing one of my neighborhood friends walk by the library door and kind of wave hello to me. So that was an interesting coming together of the two worlds that I remember. So that's the format of that book.
Well, and it captured such a like the chaos and the beauty, I think, of what homeschooling often is, where there's, kind of a lot happening and things can get kind of messy, but there's still this like deep learning that's occurring throughout that as well.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. My mom gets a little, I think she was a little nervous about the book
Mm,
because it is not always clean. The schoolroom, which is their
yeah,
living room, looks kind of messy. And in truth, it was never, maybe occasionally it got that messy, but generally it was a pretty orderly homeschool.
sure.
Um, but one of the comments I get over and over again, especially from homeschool parents, is that they're so happy I showed the creative mess of homeschooling. And it just wouldn't have been right to create a book about homeschooling that was filled with a very neat house all the time. And it wouldn't have been as interesting. And I think there's mess that's not interesting, but a creative mess. When I'm working really hard at my desk and really into a project, and there's papers here and there, and this quick experiment I tried laying over there, that to me, that's really exciting to be, because it all has this meaning and this learning and creativity behind it.
I think you let people into what homeschooling is in that way too, that there's a perception, at least and especially now, right, where there's so many online tools and there's so much that
Right,
it can feel very sterile, that it's just kind of like
right,
workbooks and entering, typing things on a computer,
right.
that there's this like my dad has this line that everything is homeschool, and he would say
Hmm.
this to us as we were kids, and we'd be visiting our grandma or going on a hike in the woods, or
Right,
identifying birds, and all of it was
no,
homeschool.
right,
And I feel like you did a phenomenal job of really capturing that feeling of sort of the broader, it's not just sitting down and doing math problems, but there's so much more to it than that.
right. We began, well, I shouldn't say my parents began in the 80s, mid 80s. So it was a pretty strange thing to do at that time.
Yeah, what
Uh,
was that like?
well, I can't say I know exactly what it was like because I would have been 6
Okay.
in 1985. And so it was a little um, kind of fly by night. I don't want to make it sound too cloak and dagger, but it was, my mom just didn't broadcast that we were homeschooling. And
Mm,
it was known, of course, anyone who knew us knew that we were homeschooling. But she also, I think starting out, she wouldn't go out with us during the day to stores because she didn't want people wondering, why are these kids not in school during the school year? That kind of thing. But then as things changed and there was a law passed in Pennsylvania about homeschooling that made it legal if you followed certain requirements, which sound a little bit like Ohio. Like we had a homeschool curriculum. Well, we had to have a curriculum. We had to submit portfolios at the end of the year and
okay.
have a certified reviewer review them. And that was in place, I think, by the early 90s. And so then at that point, things had really shifted because a lot of people discovered that they were independent of each other, homeschooling, and in Pennsylvania at least, this push to get a law passed brought a lot of homeschoolers together. And so discovered each other that way. But yeah, it was pretty, I think when it started out, it was a pretty unusual thing to do when my parents began. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet I didn't realize that it was, actually like not there that wasn't like a sanctioned thing in Pennsylvania at the time.
Right. Right. It would have been school district by school district. If a school district wanted to be tough on you and make it hard, and I don't know what if they had legal resources to come after you and take your kids to school or put pressure on you. I'm not sure how it went, but I heard stories of some school districts that were took a very hard line, and then other school districts where you could kind of do what you wanted to do,
Sure.
and they had bigger fish to fry, I guess. Other problems they were dealing with, and a few people homeschooling wasn't something they wanted to bother with. So yeah, it was interesting. Of course, I don't remember a whole lot about that. I remember going to Harrisburg, the state capital, to lobby a couple times, but
Oh
yeah,
wow. Wow.
yeah,
And you grew up more out in the country, is that right?
right. Grew up in the country. It became increasingly, I shouldn't say increasingly developed. There were more developments as time went on. But yes, out in the country, not quite as far out as building our house depicts, but it was out that definitely in the country. Um, and yeah, and so that played a role in how I grew up and how homeschooling was handled also, related to where friends were. And um, I was watching one of your videos, and you had mentioned about not having a lot of friends outside of homeschooling at one point. And it was strange because in my area, even though there weren't a lot of houses around, I think there must have been a wave of building um, by people who were of the same generation. So there were a bunch of kids in my neighborhood who went to public school, and we were the only homeschoolers. And I had very good guy friends in the neighborhood when I was a kid that I would run around with and do all the sorts of neighborhood escapades that young boys largely get into. And so it was an interesting combination of homeschool friends and public school friends and then church friends that were
Yeah.
around. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for us, we had a pretty tight knit group that we would meet with on a semi regular basis.
Hmm.
Now the thing was, it was such a wide age range, and so there were people that went down.
Yeah.
My brother was 6 years younger than me, and so they'd be down to his age, down up to a few years older than I am. So
Okay.
we would have, for instance, we had a science group that met on Mondays, and so there were parents that had more background in that. There was one
Hmm.
parent who was a marine biologist. There was another parent who was gone to med school. And so they were sort of designing curriculums that could accommodate, up and down what was like an 8 year age span that we
Right.
were existing within.
Hmm. Yeah, we got involved in co-ops probably um, around the mid 90s, early 90s was the first time we were involved in co-ops. And I think when my oldest, I have three siblings, three sisters. My oldest sister went to kindergarten, and then it was after kindergarten my parents started homeschooling.
Okay.
And so I think by the time she was getting approaching middle school age, somewhere in there, it became more important to have other homeschoolers around. So that's when we found co-ops. And at one time, we were part of a co-op that had, it must have been like 75 to 100 kids in it. So pretty
Wow.
large. It was in a church, and the church had a gym, which was the big, like that was what we went for. But it was a similar situation where there were people, moms and a dad or two, I think, who were educated, had college degrees, and they would teach in math and art and other areas. And we would all take advantage of the expertise of the pooled resources we had there.
That's
Yeah. So it
fantastic.
sounds like your parents both were educators. Is that right?
Yes, they were. So they were both elementary school teachers
Uh-huh.
in Columbus when before I was born. Um,
Okay.
and then kind of both got burnt out by the school system and were figuring out what they were going to do next with their lives. I have a sister who's 12 years older than me.
Oh,
So
wow.
so
Okay.
right as I was starting the kindergarten process, she was like starting college, right?
Yeah.
And so my parents had
And
gone through.
did she go through all of her middle school and high school in public school?
She did, yeah.
Yeah.
And she had a really good experience.
Mhm.
But as my mom said, she wasn't really interested in living anymore by the school year. She had, you know, gone to school and then gone to college and then had a kid. And then, so it was just like kind of constantly living by this like very strict school year.
Mhm.
And my dad at that point was a professional storyteller. So he would like travel around and tell stories to assemblies and groups of people, festivals and libraries and
Uh-huh.
schools. And so we had a little bit more freedom. And so they said, we were educators. Let's experiment with this. Let's see if we can do it.
Mhm.
And it worked out pretty well for us. And they ended up homeschooling both me and my two younger siblings from K to 12.
Wow. And at the time that you began homeschooling, was it already something that was happening pretty commonly in Ohio?
I think it was like starting to uptick at that point.
Uh-huh.
I think I was in first grade, kindergarten or first grade, when there was a gentleman in the community who I'm still connected with now, and he started what he called the homeschool gym. And so every day he would go around to a different rec center around the city and he would have classes for kids in different age groups. Um,
Uh-huh.
and that really became a way that, we would go there and there maybe be 50 or 100 other families throughout the day coming in for his
Right.
classes. And so that was like kind of what you're talking about, where there was like these points where people sort of pooled together,
Hmm.
and you were able to connect to a broader community, even if a lot of the time it was either in a smaller pod or just your immediate family.
Right. Yeah.
How
Huh.
was that for you? I mean, do you think about now or do you reflect on sort of what or how your life has been impacted because you grew up homeschooled?
Yeah, definitely. I don't sit around and think about it a whole lot. I generally consider it to have been a very good thing for me, especially in the area of work I'm in, which is illustration and writing and generally art. And realizing that I had a whole lot of time. This was also before, and not to be a snob, but before the computer too. So I'm one of those people that know what it's like to live without computers. I can still remember this. Um, and I'm really thankful, considering the type of art I'm making is related to nature, and that I spent a lot of that time outdoors and finding ways to entertain myself and play with friends, of course, play with my sisters. But there wasn't, I mean, we didn't even have a television until I was 13. So it simply wasn't an option. And
Right.
so there was a lot of reading, a lot of creative time, a lot of time exploring the woodland near where I should probably mention at some point that building our house is about my parents' experience building a house for their family. And so this house sits near a marshland and a stream and woodland, and is a place I still return to and is very special to me. And and so a lot of time was spent with friends and also by myself in the woodland and exploring, inventing games, that kind of thing. Generally, when I look back on homeschooling, to get back to your original question, I see it as a very positive thing. But I'm not someone who's a very strong homeschooling evangelist. I think
Right.
it can, and I think you said something similar. It can be a very good thing for certain families. My parents, oh, my mom actually has a master's in elementary education. And then she went on to become a teacher who reviewed portfolios for other homeschoolers because she had that education background and she was certified. My dad studied chemistry in college and had a very sharp mind. He could recall things from chemistry that he hadn't studied for decades, and it
Wow.
was just there. And so when it came to the higher grades, and certainly high school, he had math and sciences pretty well covered for us. And then my mom could handle history, literature, and art. By that time, I was off on my own or taking classes outside of the home. So it was, in some ways, it was ideal in the way my parents' expertise, the setting, the fact that I had neighborhood friends, but also homeschool and church friends. It's hard for me to look back and think, oh, I wish, something had gone differently. I think that if I didn't if I didn't end up doing the work I wanted to do, I kind of at a pretty young age decided I want to be an artist.
Mm.
Well, first a composer, a classical music composer, and then artist. Um, if there was some kind of major disappointment, like, oh, that didn't work out, or I didn't get to do that, maybe I would look back and think, well, it might have happened had I not been homeschooled. But as it happens, everything that I make art about comes out of that experience. And as I get older, I realize that not just the experience, but the place too, the homestead where I was born and grew up, and that very mysterious and um, atmosphere filled marshland and woodland that was near the house. It's just all of it's there. And I find I go back more and more to it to draw inspiration from. So I I don't so just the balance now. I'm not an evangelist for it. I don't say everyone should be homeschooling because clearly, and my mom came across this when she was evaluating people, other homeschoolers, there are situations where people are not getting what they should be
Right.
in
Yeah.
terms of an education. And so I um, I understand why people want to homeschool, why there was this surge in a lot of cases. But um, in my case, I would have to say I'm pretty happy with the experience. Whatever we were doing, there was always an opportunity to learn about something. If we were on vacation, this was another interesting similarity you had mentioned about not having the money to do the vacations that some other kids that you knew
Mm.
were doing. Our family was similar, but I didn't really have much of a desire to do the other vacations because we were going camping, we were going hiking. One of our best um, family vacations was a 2 week trip down to Florida and back, during which we hiked and we camped. And the destination in Florida was a aunt and uncle that lived there. And then we headed back north. And I just, there was so much richness and wealth of interaction, nature, learning, that you wouldn't get from simply hopping on a plane, flying some to a resort somewhere, and then coming back. So yeah, it was always, and there was always an opportunity to learn, whether it was figuring out something that was wrong with the van, or or on a hike seeing some nature and talking about it. Or my parents also really liked historic homesteads, so we would stop at homesteads and read about the way farming was done at a particular time in a particular era, or a particular historic figure that we'd read about. So yeah, there was no hard, definite line between school and non-school. And honestly, I think that's the way it should be for everyone. I don't think
Yeah,
that, I think your dad might have mentioned this on one of the videos I saw, that um, teachers love the students who have parents who see school as being both in the school building and also at home in the
right.
evening. And there's not this hard divide between what is school and what isn't. So that was very, very true. And then the other thing that I think was so advantageous about our homeschool was that we could, especially in the elementary years and middle school years, we could finish our work early in the day, which we did. Like if I had something that I really wanted to do, if it was a snow day, for instance, we didn't get off school for snow days.
Right, right.
And so then we would be up, like if we knew there was going to be 8 inches of snow, I'd be up at 6 in the morning doing school by 6:30 so that everything was done by 10. And then I had the rest of the day to do
Yeah.
what I wanted to do. And that allowed me to do so much more art and art making, and spend time even with friends, but
Right.
also spend time outside and spend time with my siblings, spend time with my parents. Just allowed me to go in directions that I really wanted to go in, while also still having that structure, so that my bases, the educational bases, were being covered.
Yeah, I did the same thing where,
Yeah.
I at some point realized, especially as I started to do more independent learning and it was more like you're
Hmm.
going to read this thing and, work on a project about it. And it wasn't as hands on from my parents, that I would
Right.
get up really early in the morning and get everything done by noon. And we had a big
Hmm.
old 2-car garage and I converted that into my production studio. And so I was
Hmm.
always out there building sets or working on a film project that I wanted to be
Yeah.
making. And
Yeah.
I had time to do it. And, I've been reflecting recently on, I chose not to go to high school. That was, and my
Okay.
parents, they didn't pressure me either way. There was sort of an expectation that we would just stay homeschooled, but it was a very open, like, if you want to go, like, there's no issue with going. But I think I had a degree of freedom that I could
Hmm.
I could do things that I wanted to do and I could work on these projects, and I wasn't as restricted, which caused me to just, to choose to continue to do that stuff.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think the other big thing that I learned being homeschooled was learning how to learn.
Mm,
When we worked through our lessons, our mom, especially in the kindergarten, first, second, third grade, a lot of it was with my mom.
sure.
But as time went on, there was always part of the lesson was the instruction. And we learned that if you read the instructions carefully, it would tell you how to do the problem. So we had Saxon Math was one of the curriculum, one of the books that we had for math for a number of years. And for the most part, we would read what we were learning about, what we were supposed to learn about in this lesson, and then we would do it. And then if we got stuck somewhere or we hadn't comprehended something, then we would fall back on my mom or my dad. Would come home and we'd take our problems to him and he would help us work through them. But I think learning how to learn and being excited about that realization that, oh, I can do this. I can, if I want to know about something, here's how you go about knowing about something. If I'm curious about something, here's how to go continue being curious about it and learning. And that's a very, very exciting and also empowering thing too, to know that I'm not. It's very good to have teachers who have gone before and have all this knowledge and who can lead you in ways and into areas that you might not otherwise know about. But to also know that, especially now with the internet, like there's really nothing you can't teach yourself if you continue to grow and continue to learn and continue to push into new avenues and areas. So, yeah, one of the most valuable things that come out of homeschooling, I think.
That's fantastic. I'm really curious about, sort of how you started the art and work that you do now. I mean, you're mentioning at a very young age that this was like a passion for you.
Right, it was. And I have to credit my dad especially, but both my parents for not, again, sounds very similar to your parents. They wanted us to find something that we were passionate about and something that we could really enjoy. I think in part because my dad spent much of his life at a job that supported the family. He wasn't very happy at his job. He would have liked to have something that was more in the line of work in which he had been educated, a chemistry job, something that used more of his really extraordinary ability for figures and scientific thinking. And so he was very strong on emphasizing finding something that you were passionate about.
Mm.
And so I have to credit both my parents for not pushing us, but helping us find each of their children something that they were excited about. And so from a very young age, I was interested in music. For some reason, I got hooked on classical, what's generally termed classical music. And then art was also very early an interest of mine. And it just kind of grew. They encouraged it, and I kept making it. And then there were a few key, which I can go into if you want to, there were a few key moments where I was able to really get a good education even before going to college. I know other homeschoolers are sometimes interested in, like, well, how does that transition happen? And because it was an area where my mom um, and my dad, both of them, didn't have training in art.
Mm.
And so they didn't know a whole lot where to go with it. But that's where a co op came in handy. There was another homeschool mother who had majored in art in college. And so she started some art classes in this small co op we went to for a number of years. And then seeing my ability and my interest, she suggested this was when I was getting to about high school age. She suggested this classical art academy
Oh, wow.
in near Allentown, Pennsylvania. It's not there anymore, but that took things up a number of steps. And it was a big jump, but also it was there that I realized, oh, I really like doing this. I can really apply myself. And also, I realized that compared to other people in the class, I was doing okay. Um, and and it taught me many things about drawing and design, which are still in the back of my mind, working all these many years later. So it's interesting the way it progressed from something that was a passion of mine at an early age, encouraged by my parents, to something that was taught to me and encouraged by someone knowledgeable within the homeschool community who then connected me with someone outside the homeschool community. And it was that transition that was very important. And then in high school, I was going once or twice a week to that academy until I graduated.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
And
So
what
I
was
know
the
there are much.
mediums primarily that you were studying at that academy?
Um, at the academy, we drew almost entirely in Conte crayon. People studying art will know Conte crayon. It's a French chalk and it's a kind of waxy um, black pencil, a bit like charcoal.
Okay.
And this, it was called the Barnstone Studios, and it was an incredibly rigorous. It was built on the atelier model, which is the master. There's the master of the studio, and then there's his students, the people that are studying under him. And in the classical model, these students would have actually been working on pieces that the master artist was creating, like a kind of guild model.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it wasn't like that because we weren't working on the masters. Myron Barnstone was his name. We weren't working on any of his projects, but he had a very, very rigorous idea of what good design was and good drawing skills were. And you started with drawing one and you worked out from there. And it was very tough. I mean, I do still have um, a desire to see tough teachers be tough on
Yeah.
their students' work because of that experience. I mean, I guess in part because I never really got torn apart in a critique. So maybe I wouldn't feel so good about it, but he would just let students know, if something wasn't up to the standard that they could perform at or wasn't what was needed. So
Very curious about what made you want to write children's books. Was that something you were always interested in doing?
I was always interested in the art part. I never thought about writing until my my junior year of college. And so fast forwarding, I ended up going to Messiah College, which is in Pennsylvania, mid-state Pennsylvania. And there was a wonderful professor who was himself a children's book illustrator. And he taught the only illustration class there. I took it and I loved it. And he suggested that I not wait after junior year or until senior year to start sending work off to publishers. He knew how the publishing industry in children's books work. And so he said, here's what you do. You create a cover letter, you create a series of portfolio images. At this time, email was just around, but things were still being done mostly through physical mail.
Mm.
So I think the first year I made 10 portfolios in 10 9x12 manila envelopes, sent them out. And this gets to your question. And then I waited for several months to get replies. That's how long it takes. And I got some really good feedback. I now know that my work wasn't anywhere near being ready for publication, but editors and art directors were very nice in a number of instances. And one in particular, Susan Hirschman, who's no longer living, but she was somewhat of a legend in children's book publishing. I didn't know her name at the time, but my professor said, "Oh, you should listen to her because she's really well known." She worked at Green Willow, which is a small children's publishing company. And she was the one that said, "Have you ever thought about writing your own stories?" And I had not. I just thought, well, at that point, I was finding other people's writing and using that as inspiration for stories. And so she's the one that I credit with getting me to consider whether or not writing was for me. And of course, I discovered that I enjoyed it. It dovetailed very nicely with my interest in reading and books generally. So that's where it came from.
Wow. Wow. And then what was the timeline like from, sort of that era to the time when you first, had you had your first children's book published?
Right. So that would have been in 1999 that I got that letter. And then I'll just fast forward. Wasn't until 2008 that my first book was published.
Okay.
And between that time, I spent a couple years working as a cross-stitch designer at a company in Reading, Pennsylvania. which exists in some small form, I think. Their product still exists. The company still exists there to some degree. And then after that, I went to graduate school in New York City. And from there, I got my first contract for a book called At Night, which I have a copy of right here. It's still in print. This is the Japanese translation of it. That was my my graduate thesis.
Okay.
And so we had some lecturers come in, and one of them saw it, and then there was the show, and after that, then a publishing house wanted to pick that project up and publish it. So from sending out my first mailers in 99 to 2008, almost a decade of process. So it takes a while.
Yeah, I think
Some
that's really
persistence.
important for a lot of people that are in creative fields, just to understand, because I think there's this sense of instant gratification that,
Right,
oh, I'm going to do this thing and within 6 months I'm going to be,
right,
doing it for real. But, to hear that of like, you're sending things out and it's all right. You said almost 10 years before you actually have a book published.
right. And I had done, well, there was that mailer my junior year. Then I did an entire storyboard with a few finished illustrations for a book that I sent off after my senior year. Then in graduate school, I did another book for my first year for that one, I illustrated the entire book.
Wow.
And then my thesis book. So there were two full books, more or less, that I illustrated that never got published that were leading up to that first published book. And so it would have been my late 20s when the first book appeared. And I remember my editor saying, wow, that's really something. You're still in your 20s and you got a book published. Because apparently it's, at least at that time, it was usually early 30s before anyone was published in the field. So I don't know what things are like now if people are looking and picking up illustrators and authors who are younger. But at least at the time, that seemed on the younger end of things. So it's good to remember for people who are really serious about it that it often looks like something can be instantaneous or happen quickly, but it can take a lot of time, and it takes a lot of perseverance and a lot of hard work too.
I don't want to keep you for too long, Jonathan.
Oh, that's fine.
I've really
I
appreciated this conversation.
Yeah, this is really fun, and I knew I would enjoy talking to you. Um, I did, yeah, I stalked you just a little bit, but I'm not really, because they're YouTube videos you've put out. So
I
I'm
have,
only
yes.
I'm only consuming your content. But what I learned about your family sounds like there were a lot of parallels, and I enjoyed hearing about your homeschool experience. And yeah, it's been great. Thanks for having me.
Oh,
Thanks for talking.
absolutely. I remember, I mean, I came across your book about homeschooling, and it really truly felt like I've never seen a children's book that so maps out what my growing up was like. Like it was really cool to see that reflected
Yeah,
in a piece of art.
yeah. Well, that's really gratifying to hear, because it was a little bit of a struggle to figure out how to make this something that was going to be interesting. But I also think that, especially for people who don't know a lot about homeschooling, they are very curious, like what is this all about? So it's good from another homeschooler to hear that they saw themselves reflected in the book.
Yes, yes. So if people want to check out, your work, if they want to purchase your work, what's the best place for them to do that?
Um, First, I say go to well, if you just want to look at the work, a lot of libraries have my books. If you want to order a book, I like to direct people to Indie First. If you want to go online, where they'll connect you with bookstores, local independent bookstores, You can order the books through them. So that's the first route. If you already have a local independent bookstore that you like, go there and ask them to order a book for you. But I do direct people to Amazon as well. Some people don't have a local bookstore, and you can find my books on Amazon. I also have an Amazon author illustrator page, Jonathan Bean. You can look up Building Our House. You can find my page that way too. It needs to be updated, but it's there, so you can find me there. So those are the ways that I usually recommend people find the book and purchase the book.
Fantastic. I will link those down below in the description.
All right. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, this has been awesome, man. I've wanted to talk with you for a while, and so this has been so cool to like both hear about, your growing up in the publishing world and all of it. So I so appreciate you taking the time to sit down today and doing this podcast.
Great. Thank you.